Okay, hello and welcome to the second lecture in modern political theory. Today we're going to start coming to grips with the first of our major authors on the syllabus, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is, of course, one of the greatest of all Western philosophers and political theorists, tremendously influential figure, in some ways a very notorious figure in the Western philosophical tradition for reasons that will become clear in due course. For many, Hobbes is the quintessential modern political thinker, for good or for ill. I hope you're looking forward to coming to grips with him. You'll find him tremendously stimulating and rewarding. He repays your effort and attention always. But you may find his texts a little unwieldy and sometimes difficult to understand. He's writing, obviously, in 17th century English, which may be a little bit unfamiliar to you. But do persist, because you will, as I say, find your efforts rewarded. If you're struggling with the text, if you have things that don't make sense to you, please don't hesitate to call on me or your TA for help. And of course, I will be trying in my lectures to decode and demystify Hobbes so as to aid your efforts to understand the text. There are a couple of things hanging over, though, from my first more general lecture, and so I promise we'll get to Hobbes, but there's a couple of holdovers of a more general nature that I want to talk about first. You'll recall that my first lecture attempted to characterize, in rather general terms, modernity and its characteristic outlook, its characteristic concerns, the nature of the modern epoch and the changes and transformations that the authors on our syllabus were living through. But I was talking in very general terms about themes that seem to me to be typical of modern forms of thought and the modern outlook, and that are going to recur in what you're going to be reading and talking about over this semester. But I didn't say anything very specific about the specifically political aspects of modernity. And I want to just emphasize, because they're going to be the defining, framing themes of everything that comes after this, the characteristic subject matter of modern political theory, because there are two issues that seem to me to be definitive and central to modern political theory as such. There's other stuff going on, of course, but these are going to be the central issues on which we're going to focus. First and most obviously, there is the question of the modern state and the claims that it makes to organize and structure the lives of individual citizens. Where does its authority come from? What are its claims to authority based on? And how far does its authority over individual citizens extend? That's going to be a central question for all of our authors. We're going to hear different authors offering slightly different and often divergent answers to that question, but that's, of course, going to be a major theme. But the second theme that we're also going to be talking about has to do with economics. It has to do with the development of commercial capitalism in this period. You'll remember with my little story about the growth of Manchester and the pictures that I showed you. Got to remember, this is the time of the takeoff of commercial development in the West. The Industrial Revolution is ongoing during this period. And economic cooperation is assuming new forms at this time. And one of the questions that all of these authors wrestle with is how to come to terms with this and what it means for the structure and organization of politics. So all of our authors have things to say about these, although, as you know, some emphasize the first question rather more than the second, and vice versa. Notice just a small point, but it's an important one. When I refer for these purposes, to the modern state and the market or the free market or commercial capitalism, I'm doing more than just using these terms as abstract general categories that are synonymous with the political sphere and the economic sphere. Because it's very, very important for you to realize that the modern state and the capitalist free market are historically specific forms of political life and political organization and forms of economic cooperation and reproduction. They haven't always existed, and they are coming to be during the epoch in which these authors are writing. And they're aware of this for the most part. They recognize that the structure of politics is new and different from what has come before. They recognize that the terms of economic cooperation are transforming themselves from what was in place in earlier periods. So when I refer to the state and the market, I'm referring to something more specific than just the general contrast between political life and economic life. You can draw that general distinction probably in all periods, in all human cultures, in all human societies. Even if we're, an anthropologist studying some social group in the Amazonian rainforest, you can probably still draw a distinction between, as it were, the political side of their interaction and the more economic side of their interaction. If you're talking about them, you're not really going to be talking about anything resembling the modern state or a commercial capitalist free market. What's really important about modern political theory is that the main figures recognize that the modern state and the market are new, and they're trying to come to terms with and give accounts of this. In turning to Hobbes, of course, although he certainly has things to say about economic matters and about the market, and we'll get to that in due course, of course, in turning to Hobbes, we're turning to someone who is mainly concerned with the first of our two questions. He's mainly concerned with the modern state, and he wants to offer a general account of its legitimacy. So if the modern state is a new thing in this epoch, what exactly is new about it? In what sense is it different from what has come before? I want to say just a little bit about this because it's going to prepare the ground for understanding what Hobbes is up to. First of all, the modern state, as compared with other political forms, is distinctive in that the modern state claims for itself supremacy over all other powers within its jurisdiction. It claims to be the ultimate authority within its particular sphere. One of the ways in which we express this today, going back to a formulation of the great German sociologist Max Weber, is that we say that the state claims a monopoly on the right to use force, right? And that's a new thing in this period. It's a new thing because in the pre-modern period, it is not true that the state is the only organization that claims the right to use force. The aristocracies, the feudal lords, they had their own armies and private militias, and they defended their own rights using violence, and they were understood to have their own entitlement to use these kinds of powers in their own patch. And so, as you know, medieval history is very often a history of struggle between monarchs, who represent, as it were, the secular government, and private aristocrats and aristocratic families. They're continually feuding over the question of what they may and may not do, and they're engaged in constant struggles, right? So the modern state is emerging from that struggle. Important also to realize that for large portions of the medieval and late medieval period, the church also claimed some of the powers that the modern state is eventually going to claim for itself. You've got to remember that the church had its own system of law, canon law. It had its own system of enforcement in the form of courts. It executed punishments physically, right? It used force against people. Think of the Inquisition. Think of the Crusades, when the Catholic Church actually mustered armies and engaged in campaigns of conquest, right? So in earlier periods, it just wasn't true that there was a general understanding that the power of the state was ultimate and unique. Rather, in earlier periods, the powers of secular monarchs and princedoms and so forth was in a kind of continual struggle with various co-equal forces, right? And what's new about the modern state is this attempt to assert itself as having supremacy over all of these other powers. And that's a new thing. It typically has territorial integrity. Again, not always true in the previous periods. Again, the church is a good illustration of this. The church claims a certain kind of authority. Canon law extends during the medieval period across all of Christendom, and it thus permeates through other secular jurisdictions. But again, in the modern period, the state tends to want to consolidate itself territorially, and that's, to some extent, a new thing. The modern state claims its legitimacy not, or increasingly, I should perhaps say, increasingly claims its legitimacy not on the basis of divine ordination or religious authority, nor does it claim to represent any particular social group, any particular religious congregation, any particular social class, any particular dynasty, any particular generation, right? And again, there's a real contrast here from earlier periods, right? For large parts of the medieval period, the state claims its legitimacy in some way from being ordained by God. There's some kind of religious sanction to it. And of course, since the feudal period is a period of struggles between dynasties, between aristocratic families, and since secular authority is often held by dynastic families, like the Tudors or the Bourbons in France or the Habsburgs, right? There's a strong tendency to associate the claims to authority of particular social groups with their membership of particular social classes or particular dynastic families, and so on and so forth, right? And that's a feature of the old order that gets swept away in the modern period, because the modern state doesn't claim that its authority and legitimacy is based on these particular kinds of associations and affiliations. Rather, it claims to speak and act impartially on behalf of all of its citizens, and it derives its legitimacy from that claim. The state is in that sense, in a sense that is familiar to us, it is we, the people, and increasingly in the modern period, as I said in the last lecture, there's an emphasis on the idea that its authority comes from below, right? There are some other important basic features of the modern concept of the state that I want to highlight, all of which I think, first of all, we still accept, and the two Hobbes wishes to explain. So, Hobbes is still very relevant for us because he's trying to offer an account, as we'll see, of things that we still are inclined to intuitively regard as plausible. The first is an implication of something I've already talked about, the monopoly on the right to use force. It's an implication of the idea that the state has a monopoly on the right to use force, that, perhaps puzzlingly, the state is understood to be morally permitted to do things that private citizens are normally prohibited from doing. This is, of course, clearest in the case of punishment, right? I can't take one of you because I don't like you and incarcerate you in my basement for as long as I want, right? But when the state arrests you, prosecutes you, and convicts you of a crime, the state does that, right? When the state executes people, the state does something that private citizens are ordinarily prohibited from, right? And that's a corollary of this idea that the state has a monopoly on the right to use force. We, as private citizens living under modern states, accept that there are limits on what we can do, but that these limits don't necessarily apply to the state. And that's, of course, a puzzling thing. What is it about a bunch of grey-suited civil servants wandering around the corridors of some administrative agency, what allows them to engage in actions that we would normally regard as morally impermissible, right? And that's a puzzle that a theory of the state needs to solve. The modern state is also an agent. It's an actor. It has powers. It claims for itself certain rights. It claims to have interests of its own, right? We don't always notice this, but our ordinary idea of a national interest, right? We did this in the national interest. That implies that the state is an agent with its own preferences, its own goals, its own interests. And we think of the modern state as deliberating about how it ought to pursue and prosecute its own interests, right? So we think of it as a kind of actor, as a kind of agent. And that's going to be very, very important for Hobbes's political theory in particular. Not for nothing that arms of the state often describe themselves as agencies, right? Think of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, right? And that includes the idea that the state is something that acts in the world and that claims powers, exercises those powers for reasons in view of a certain understanding of its own interests. In acting in that way, we would normally think the state enables the people as a group to act together as a collective unit. When we declare war on Germany or Iraq or whoever it is, there's a sense in which we are all declaring war on Iraq. We're all complicit in this declaration, right? And the state and its existence is what makes that possible. And again, it's a somewhat puzzling question. It raises certain issues about whether, if we're complicit in a declaration of war, whether we're also ourselves in some way responsible for what is done in our name in the course of the warfare itself, right? Complicated questions. I mean, you know, if the United States launches a drone strike in the Middle East and kills in collateral damage a number of innocent civilians, accidentally, unintentionally, is there a sense in which all of us, or all of you, since I'm not an American citizen, all of you are partly responsible for that? Is that partly your doing? And that's a difficult question, and Hobbes has things to say about that. The state is also distinct from the government. This is an important point. People often miss it, but it's really, really key. The state is the underlying authority that empowers and authorizes government agencies on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, right? So the Trump administration, which is currently running the executive branch of the United States, that is an aspect of the government of the United States, right? But the United States itself, as a modern state, stands behind that and remains the same, even as different governing administrations rotate in and out of office, right? So we had Donald Trump. Then before him, we had Barack Obama. Before him, we had George W. Bush. These represent the cycling of different governing coalitions. Different political parties come into office and come out of office. Nobody thinks that when the government changes, that means that the state has changed, right? These are changes merely at the level of government, but they're not changes in the fundamental identity of the state itself. So it's very important to see, this is very important for Hobbes in particular, that the state is something deeper than and larger than just the government. The state is an object of allegiance and loyalty, something, again, we often overlook. But in the United States, as all of you know, school children are made to pledge their allegiance to the flag and the state every day in school. It's a puzzling ritual, but one we take for granted, and it shows that the state thinks of itself as an object of allegiance and loyalty. It's also the locus of membership. Americans speak of their fellow Americans, and there's some sense in which I share something with my fellow citizens, but it's often a little bit puzzling to, well, what is it that makes a German a German? What is it that makes a Belgian a Belgian? What is it that makes an Irish person an Irish person? How is that membership to be understood? States, as I've already mentioned, claim territoriality. They control land and often control access to it, certainly claim the right to do so. And states oversee and promote something nebulously called national culture. Right? They engaged in defining and protecting the heritage of the nation in a variety of ways. These are all features of the modern concept of the state. They're tied in closely with what I was talking about on the previous slide. They're things that we all just take for granted, but they're not all features that have always existed. Right? These are distinctive. This is a distinctive modern understanding of how political power should be organized. And of course, the question arises, what are all of these distinctive modern political claims based on? And Hobbes offers us an answer to that question. Just a few words about Hobbes himself. I don't want to get too bogged down in the biography, but there he is, handsome fellow, lived from 1588 to 1689. I think that's wrong. Those dates are wrong. I'll correct that. Sorry, can't possibly be right. He did have a long life, but he didn't have quite that long a life, I think. So I'll correct that. He comes from a middle-class background. He grew up in Malmesbury, which is about halfway between Bristol and Oxford, if you know your English geography. This is what explains his later nickname, the Beast of Malmesbury. He was a student at Oxford, at Magdalen Hall. Later had an association and affiliation with Cambridge University, although he never taught there in any formal sense. He spent his entire career in the employ of an aristocratic patron, the Earl of Devonshire and his family. Mostly he was a secretary and a tutor to the Earl of Devonshire himself and various members of the family. A couple of things that are perhaps worth mentioning along in this general connection. He, in that capacity, served briefly as Francis Bacon's amanuensis. He worked with Bacon on writing out, he was a scribe helping Bacon write out some essays, so he was familiar with and intimate with our old friend Francis Bacon, whom I talked a bit about in the last lecture. Under the patronage of the Earl of Devonshire, he was able to make several visits to Europe in his early life, and that enabled him to get plugged into some of the cutting-edge intellectual developments on continental Europe, especially in science and philosophy. He becomes familiar with the work of Galileo. He is in correspondence later with the French mathematician and philosopher Descartes, and is very much interested in these cutting-edge intellectual developments, becomes very interested in optics in particular, and is interested in scientific subjects as well as in political ones. And I'll say a little bit more about that, I think, next time. Of course, Hobbes lives through the English Civil War and Revolution of the 1640s. As you know, the English Civil War breaks out essentially as a conflict between the English crown under the Stuart monarchs, James I and II, and Charles I. The Stuart monarchs come into conflict with Parliament, and this comes to a head in the 1640s and results in Parliament and the crown going to war with each other, and so the country is divided into two groups: one that is partisan, one partisan of Parliament, often referred to as the Roundheads, and the other group defending the royalist cause, often called the Cavaliers, from which I believe our notion of the UVA Cavaliers is from. So, there's a sense in which, as a royalist in the English Civil War, which Hobbes was, Hobbes is really, in some sense, a Wahoo. There's also a slightly more sinister connection to Virginia, which is perhaps worth noting. In his early part of his career, Hobbes was part of the Virginia Company, which, of course, was the commercial company that was overseeing the Virginia colonies. And in that sense, like Locke also, there's a sense in which he is directly implicated in the slave trade. That's something to keep in mind, especially as you read what Hobbes has to say about slavery, and also what Locke has to say about slavery, because it puts their somewhat hair-raising remarks about legitimate slavery in stark relief. So keep that in mind. I'll have occasion to talk about this in case of both Hobbes and Locke in coming lectures. And we are, of course, concerned with the 1651 publication of the Leviathan, which comes out just at the end of the first resolution of the English Civil War. As you know, there's this fight between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians. That war is won in the late 1640s by Parliament, and the Parliament abolishes the monarchy in England. Charles I is beheaded in a deed that foreshadows in some ways the beheading of Louis XVI in the French Revolution about 140 years later. And in 1651, Hobbes is writing during the period of the English Republic. Oliver Cromwell establishes a non-monarchical republican regime in England, which lasts not very long through the 1660s. But it's important to emphasize all of this because Leviathan is written against the background of all of this turmoil and political tumult. Leviathan is the first major, and still, for many, certainly me, still the greatest single work of political theory in the English language. As I mentioned in my last lecture, up until the early part of the 17th century, the language of intellectual life was still Latin. And so his publication of Leviathan in English is itself something of a landmark. It's the first major work of philosophy, really, and political theory in the English language. And as you'll see, it's in many ways a deeply disturbing book, but it's also a very challenging book. It's possible, and I think it will be useful, to state the central political argument of Leviathan in very bare bones summary terms. I'm going to be complicating this picture, but I think you'll find it helpful to keep in mind the sort of high altitude view of what Leviathan is basically arguing politically. And this is a crude simplification, but it gives you enough to kind of make headway. I'll be complicating this story in the course of these coming lectures, but this is the basic idea. Hobbes wants to argue in Leviathan, and in his other works in political theory, because he wrote several others, he wants to argue that life without a state, in an anarchic, as he's going to call it, state of nature, would be intolerable, would be violent, it would be conflict-ridden, and it would be insecure because there are certain problems that are inherent in the human predicament, right? If we were forced to live under completely anarchic situations, which was every person for themselves, our lives would be miserable and insecure and ridden with conflict. Agents who lived under such anarchical conditions would find them intolerable and would accordingly be strongly motivated to band together and institute a state to put an end to their endemic conflicts and establish in their place peace, law, and order. They would sign, Hobbes is going to argue, a social contract, in which they agree with each other to obey a sovereign, which becomes, of course, the state, what Hobbes sometimes calls a mortal god, that is thereby authorized to coerce and terrify everyone into compliance, and thereby to establish law and order. By understanding the likely terms of this agreement, this social contract, Hobbes thinks we can explain and justify the legitimate powers of the state over its citizens. This, in very, very outlined skeletal form, is Hobbes's basic position, right? This is enough for a Cliff Note summary. It's enough to get by in a cocktail party discussion if Hobbes comes up, but it's not enough for this class. We're going to be having to flesh out these the details of his theory, which on inspection turn out to be extremely interesting and very, very challenging. But the basic structure of his view is represented in the famous cover of Leviathan, which is on your slide there. It's obviously probably very small, but you can see most of it clearly enough, I think, to get the general idea. So this is an iconographic representation of Hobbes's basic position, right? So look at the top part of the image. You'll see there in the foreground a town that seems to be at peace and at one with itself, people wandering around the square. There is elaborate architecture, there are churches, things seem to be all in good order. Outside the city walls, you see a peaceful, bucolic, rural landscape. Bambi is wandering around, cherubs are singing in the trees, everything looks like milk and honey and peace and calm, and everything is lovely. But looming over this pastoral and peaceful scene of civic order, there is this terrifying, monstrous figure. Right? And that terrifying, monstrous figure is, of course, the state. And it's what Hobbes is referring to as the Leviathan. And there are a couple of other things I want you to notice about this picture. It's probably very hard for you to see, but you'll notice that the body of this terrifying monster looming over the landscape is made up of little scales. Right? And this, of course, is a reference to the sea monster Leviathan that is depicted in the Hebrew Bible in Job, right? And so the title of this book is a reference to this scriptural text from Job. And Leviathan is described there as a reptilian monster, terrifying reptilian monster with scales. But what you perhaps can't see very clearly on your picture is that if you zoomed in on this picture, and you can go and look at this yourself online, or I think the book you have has a reproduction of this image, those scales are actually little individual people. And that's really going to be important, because what Hobbes is saying, I'll talk about this more in a moment, what Hobbes is saying is that this terrifying monster, although it seems other than us, although it seems like it's menacing us from outside our society, it is nonetheless made up of us, right? It's made up of individual citizens. It's something that we ourselves constitute, right? Just a couple of other things about the image. You'll notice that in the monster's right hand we have a sword. That signifies the exercise of power by the state. In the monster's left hand we have the scepter, which represents the authority of the state. And it's worth noting, if you just look at the two columns underneath each of these, it's worth noticing the images that come under the sword and the scepter, because this is also an anticipation of some of the themes of Hobbes's work. Under the sword, we have a fortress or a castle. We have an image of a crown. We have an image of a cannon. We have an image of an arsenal of weapons. And at the bottom, we have an image of a battlefield. And what's being signified there is that this terrifying monster is an agency of coercion and force. It fights wars. It uses weapons. It blows people up. It builds fortresses and drops boiling oil on people who are besieging, right? It does lots of nasty, unpleasant, violent things. Notice that under the scepter, we have a church, we have a bishop's mitre, we have a thunderbolt that represents unseen forces. We have what look like a series of forks and they look like agricultural implements. What they actually are horns of dilemmas and trilemmas in the logical sense, right? And that, along with the image at the bottom on the right, is intended to represent universities, right? Because at the bottom you have a bunch of scholars debating in a scholarly disputation. These forks that are actually horns of logical dilemmas, they represent argument and philosophical discourse. So notice what's being said there, that the scepter, the source of authority in the state, claims authority over the church, over the episcopacy, over bishops, over unseen forces, and over educational life. And what's being said there, really important, is that this monster claims authority to regulate absolutely everything, including thought, speech, education, and religion, right? Just a word on the language of Leviathan. I've already mentioned that this is an allusion to the book of Job. This is the passage from which, there's a passage in Job that is being referenced. I want to read it to you because it's a fantastic passage, and you'll see some significance in some of the language for Hobbes. I'm going to read it in a Scottish accent because an English accent is too weak to do justice to this. I'm originally from Scotland, so I'm allowed to do this. This is what the book of Job says. His scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined to one another, they stick together, they cannot be sundered. The flakes of his flesh are joined together, they are firm in themselves, they cannot be moved. His heart is as firm as a stone, yea, as hard as a piece of the nether millstone. When he raiseth himself up, the mighty are afraid. By reason of breakings they purify themselves. The sword of him that layeth at him cannot hold, the spear, the dart, nor the habergeon. He esteemeth iron as straw, and brass as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones are turned with him into stubble. Darts are accounted as stubble. He laugheth at the shaking of a spear. Sharp stones are under him. He spreadeth sharp pointed things upon the mire. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He maketh the sea like a pot of ointment. He maketh a path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary. Upon earth there is not his equal, who is made without fear. He beholdeth all high things. He is a king over the children of pride. Who are the children of pride for Hobbes? The children of pride are the citizens of the Leviathan state who have to be kept in order, who have to, by means of fear and terror, be overawed and intimidated and coerced into living peacefully together. That's where Hobbes is heading. And I've already given you, obviously, in the form of that image, and what I earlier said, giving an overview of Hobbes's position. I've already given you a kind of bare outline of what he's up to. What I'm now going to do is to get into more detail about the theory, help you navigate your way through some of the details, and help you to appreciate what is really challenging and difficult about Hobbes's theory, because as you can see, this is a somewhat brutal view. The state is an agency of terror in Hobbes's account. The state has absolute power to control thought, speech, and religion on Hobbes's account. Citizens, as you're going to see, have virtually no right to resist the authority of the state on Hobbes's account. These are conclusions you are very likely to find yourself resisting, and yet, as we'll see, it's not easy to see why Hobbes's conclusions along these lines are wrong. It's difficult to refute him because his assumptions and the arguments that he makes are ones that you will find in many ways quite sophisticated and subtle and powerful. What motivates Hobbes in developing this political theory? You've got to remember Hobbes' context is a time of deep unrest, conflict, and ferment. There are many different sources of this. Part of it I've already mentioned. The modern state is struggling to assert its supremacy and to centralize itself at the heart of its territorial jurisdictions. It's struggling against the aristocracy, against other nobility, noble families. It's struggling against the church. It's trying to assert itself. And that's giving rise to an enormous amount of social conflict, social and political conflict in all of the European states. Remember that just a century earlier, the Reformation has taken place. And this, of course, causes major ructions throughout Europe, pitting Christians against each other and against the Catholic Church, which itself is a highly resourced, wealthy institution that itself claims some right to use force. I mean, during the 16th century, after the Reformation, the Catholic Church is constantly interfering in the secular politics of other countries. Just one example, towards the end of the 16th century, the Pope himself, Pope Pius, I believe, was directly involved in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth I of England. So the church is not just sort of sitting in the background, not dirtying its hands with power politics and struggle. It's completely involved in it, and of course all of this has been weaponized and rendered all the more doctrinally complicated by this gathering controversy about the meaning of religious faith itself that the Protestant reformers have themselves initiated. As a result of all of this, the century before Hobbes sits down to write Leviathan is a century of more or less continuous bloody war in Europe between 1608 and 1648, 1618 and 1648. You have the 30 Years' War. 30 years is a long time to be at war. All of these wars are fueled by religion and by struggles over state authority. There is a further element to all of this, which is that this is a time of cultural and philosophical ferment. This in part has to do with the scientific revolution, and one illustration of this is, of course, Galileo's conflict with the church. Galileo calls into question some cosmological assumptions that the church defended on the basis of its reading of Genesis and Scripture about how the world was created and what its structure is. And so people are saying, well, who's right in all of this? How do we adjudicate this conflict between what the Bible says and what, following Francis Bacon, the deliverances of our senses are telling us? We look through our telescope, we see that the universe has a certain set of characteristics. This conflicts with what it says in the Bible. So who decides, right? So it's a time where people are increasingly being struck by skepticism. Keep in mind, too, this is a period of outward expansion. Europeans are exploring, colonizing unfamiliar parts of the world, and they're coming back with stories of societies that are organized in completely different ways. They're fascinated by stories of cannibalism, for example. Montaigne writes a famous essay about cannibals in the late 16th century. What is it about cannibals that strikes them? It's that these are societies whose norms and ethics are completely different from European understandings of ethics. These are societies that have never read the Bible. They've never had the truth revealed to them, but yet they seem to be organizing themselves around their own religious beliefs and their own cultural norms perfectly happily. What are we to make of all of this diversity? One response is to say, we don't know. Who is to decide? Where is the authority in all of this, right? And of course, in the absence of a clear authority, a clear source of criteria for adjudicating disputes and controversies, whether they be religious, as in the case of the Reformation, or scientific, or to do with political questions and political authority, it becomes very, very hairy how you resolve some of these endemic disputes. That's Hobbes' context. He sees all of these phenomena as linked, and he sees them as all symptoms of a larger crisis of authority, a kind of sense of confusion about where authority in different jurisdictions and in different areas of life comes from, in science, in religion, in politics, and so forth. And And he holds this confusion about the origins and sources of authority responsible for endemic war and conflict during his lifetime. And so the overarching aim and motivation of his theory is to offer a philosophical view that can explain how to put an end to this conflict and promote peace, how we can properly identify authority in the world and definitively and once and for all settle these disputes that are resulting in violence, conflict, and the destruction of life and the prevention of all the other things that human beings might be able to do to live well and happily. And he wants to convince you that his Leviathan state is necessary to bring this about, and furthermore, that you are rationally compelled to support it. So he thinks of this book as itself intervening in all of this, because he hopes that the effect of his arguments will be to convince you to accept the authority of this monstrous Leviathan state that is described on that front page of his famous book. That's what he's trying to do. It's an interesting and challenging project. So let me end with a couple of things that will hopefully help you as you read into this text. Hobbes assumes that the state and its authority are neither natural, as especially people in the Aristotelian tradition had claimed, nor ultimately supernatural, as Christian theism tends to imply, right? For someone like Aristotle, if you pick up Aristotle's Politics, very early on, Aristotle says the state exists by nature. He has almost a biological theory of how the state arises, right? And Hobbes thinks that's a complete mistake. He thinks that trees are natural, he thinks our bodies are natural, he thinks mountains are natural, he thinks worms and slugs are natural, the sea is natural, but the state is not. The state is something created. It's artificial. It doesn't exist by nature. We have to construct it, right? He also rejects the idea that the state is ultimately supernatural, right? And that may seem like a strange thing to be thinking, but in the medieval period, during the time of the dominance of Christian theology, of course it was absolutely standard to assume that the state did have some kind of supernatural standing, because on an orthodox Christian view, God creates the world and everything in it for our good. And to the extent that you believe that the state, secular authority, does some good in the world, it protects people, it maybe promotes certain forms of justice and human welfare and human flourishing and so forth, to the extent that the state accomplishes these things, it must be seen as part of God's divine benevolent will for us. And this is a pretty standard view in medieval times. You find it in Aquinas, you find it in St. Augustine. And if you take that view, of course, ultimately you're committed to saying that the authority of the state, its goodness, its legitimacy, in some sense reflects the divine authority of God, right? It's in some sense a reflection of God's divinity, right? Of course, they're careful not to say that it just is God's authority. They're aware that human institutions are imperfect and won't ever perfectly reflect God, right? But they do tend to see the state as having some supernatural authorization. And Hobbes rejects that, right? For Hobbes, you have to understand the state as artificial. It's a contrivance. You've probably taken feminist theory classes in which you've heard people say that now that we've read lots of 20th century feminism, we believe in social construction, and it's often presented as a kind of new thing in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, right? Hobbes was way ahead of the feminists on this, right? He already recognizes that the state is a social construction. It's an artificial being. He assumes, and this explains his early moves in Leviathan, he assumes it has to be analyzed, therefore, as something we, the people, create or author together from below. It's something that we manufacture, right? It's not something that's there by nature, and if we don't intervene, it won't come to be. And it's also not something that is ordained from above by God. Secondly, and this is the point about an artificial man, the sort of central opening move of the book, right in the introduction. What we create when we construct the state is a kind of person with rights, interests, the capacity to deliberate, choose, and act. That's Hobbes's point of departure, right? The state is an artificial man. Again, think of the image on the front cover of this monster that is constituted by little scales, each of which represents an individual citizen, right? That's the point of that, right? It's ours. We create it, right? It's a piece of social technology that we ourselves contrive and construct, right? I want to end. I realize I'm running short on time, but I think I can quickly get these things in because it'll help you, I think, understand the text. Notice some of the deep implications of this Hobbesian commitment to thinking of the state as an artificial person. First, the state for Hobbes is a we that we ourselves construct. You have to think of the state for Hobbes as nothing but human beings choosing to exercise power over themselves in this particular kind of way, in the particular configuration of state power that he recommends. None of this is coming from nature. None of this is coming from God. It's coming from within ourselves, and it's a matter of our choosing to govern ourselves in this way. And that's, for Hobbes, the significance of the state as an artificial person. It's a social technology that we ourselves construct as a means for self-government. It follows from this that if we're going to understand the state, we have to give an account of how its authority comes from within ourselves. In what sense we individually are implicated in the authority it has over us. And of course, why we have reason to endorse that authority and to recognize its legitimacy. And that's what Hobbes' book is trying to do. It's trying to convince you that the authority of the state actually comes from in you. And the argument is trying to convince you that on reflection, you yourself authorize and are happy to legitimize this terrifying monster to keep yourself and your fellows in order. The last thing I'll say, this is really important, and I'm sorry to be sort of rushing it a little bit at the end, but again, I think I can get this in. When you start reading part 1 of Leviathan, entitled Of Man, right, keep what I've just been talking about in mind. This business about how we together construct political authority and political institutions as artificial things, right? That's what's guiding him in part 1 of Man. It's not helpful to instead do what many readers do and pick up this book and see that the beginning of the book is called Of Man, and assume something like the following. Yes, well, this is your standard political theory, starts with a theory of human nature, and then, having defended a bunch of assertions about what human nature is like, the author then goes on to justify a certain kind of political regime as fitting that conception of human nature. That is a completely simple-minded way to think about what Hobbes is up to. It's also misleading because, as I've emphasized, Hobbes doesn't think of the state as having anything to do with nature. He thinks it's a completely artificial creation. So he has no part of his argument has this Aristotelian flavor that says, well, our nature is to be a certain kind of way, and we can just read off our nature a certain set of claims about what politics should be like. To read Hobbes in that way is completely wrong, right? Because he's precisely wanting to break with any such kind of naturalism, as I've already said. So don't think of the point of part 1 in that simple-minded way, as just a kind of back-of-the-envelope, half-assed theory of human nature. That's the Cliff Notes version of Hobbes. We don't want that. The better way to approach part one of man, and I'll say a bit more about this obviously in the next lecture, is to think of Hobbes as recognizing, look, since the state is an artificial person, it's an agent, it acts, it decides, it has interests, it has rights, it has preferences, it has goals. Since that's the kind of thing the state is, we need a working understanding of what a person is. Only if we have a working understanding of what it is to be a person will we be in a position to understand what it is that we create and constitute when we come together as members of an artificial person that we call the state or the sovereign, right? That's the real reason that he starts with all this stuff about psychology and the clockwork of human knowledge and nature and language, because he needs a working understanding of what it is to be a person that he can then use to develop his picture of what a state is. All right, enough. I've gone over time. I apologize for that. I will try to compensate for that in the next lecture. Thank you for listening. See you all soon. Happy Hobbes.